This channel's getting to be a pain because I'm changing my mind constantly on what I want to add to my collection. And this is no exception with the Zenith Chronomaster Sport. Welcome to Wrist Swap. My name is Harrison. Today we're talking about the Zenith Chronomaster Sport and whether or not it looks like a Rolex Daytona and what I think about it, what I like about it. Simply put, this watch makes me want to be flashy. It makes me want to do things that I wouldn't otherwise do just so that I can wear this watch. I don't have the ability to wear something that's loud on a day-to-day basis that doesn't fit my job. I can't wear dress watches, and I can't wear anything that's this flashy with the ceramic bezel reflecting off of everything, but I wish I could. And I'm trying to make a way for this to fit my life in my mind right now, and I'm trying to get it to stick around. That's how much I like this watch. Zenith is a brand that's not really recognized or talked about all that often, but they're a really important brand. They started in 1865 by a watchmaker who essentially was really good at creating reliable movements. He actually named the company Zenith, changed his name to Zenith because it was the name of a movement that he made that got an award. He received multiple awards, mostly for pocket watches. Then he moved into wristwatches, and then the big link of their history to now is going to be in the Primero movement, which is what this one has inside it. The year was 1969, and not only was the space race going on in 69 for the trip to the moon, there also was a race for the first automatic chronograph. There were three main competitors for the automatic chronograph: Seiko and their mite, Zenith, who was actually the same company as Movado at the time. The third one is a collaboration between Heuer, Breitling, Hamilton, and Dubois-Deprat. Now, who won is a little contentious. In January, we know that Zenith announced that the movement was going to be coming out, although it wasn't released to the public until September. Seiko released their automatic movement only to the Japanese public in May, and then just after that, the consortium of Hamilton, Breitling, and Heuer released theirs just after Seiko, but before Zenith. So they were all in the same time period. Whether or not you say the announcement or the actual release, whether it had to be a full-scale release, is all contentious, but essentially those were the big competitors at the time. Zenith's was very different than most of the other ones because it was very traditional in its watchmaking. Their original attempt was going to be to have it done by 1965, but they wanted to have a calendar movement on it. They wanted it to have a 36,000 beats per hour movement. The concept there being that if it was a chronograph, you want it to actually stop at a time that actually makes sense. So if you start a register and you stop it, normal movements are 8 times a second. They beat 8 times a second. 7/8 of a second gives you a lot less information than 8/10 of a second. The 7/8 causes fractions and confusion, and if you've ever built things, 7/8 to 6/16 to all that is very confusing for people that aren't in the trades, and so the less fractions you have, the better. So Zenith created a movement to fit to 1/10 of a second. It also had a column wheel chronograph in it. So this is the updated version of the Primero movement. They've changed out a silicone hairspring. It still has a traditional regulator on it. It's not a free sprung balance. It also has the column wheel on it, and it is a horizontal clutch. I'll talk about that in another video. Essentially, you can't leave the chronograph running indefinitely. This does look like the bezel itself is very similar to the Daytona. I can't deny that the bezel itself on the outside here does look like that. On the inside though, everything looks like a Zenith. Those overlapping tricolor registers are probably my favorite part about this watch. And for me, when I look at it, it looks a little bit better than some of the things I've seen in the Daytona. When I've seen that in person compared to this, I kind of like those tricolors. I like the variation that it adds to the overall dial layout. You don't just have black and white in a monochromatic scheme, you also have some of these other colors kind of playing in there. And it's a nice look. What I really like about these registers is that everything's base 60. So on the left-hand side, you have the running 60 seconds. On the right-hand side, you have the running 60 seconds for the chronograph. And down at 6 o'clock, you have the 60-second minute track. So they all kind of mirror each other, which on a chronograph, typically you have minutes, hours, and they're all different bases. And so I really like that base 60 on all of them. The red touch on the seconds hand of both the running chronograph that rotates once every 10 seconds, the running seconds, and the minute track are also really nice because if you don't know chronographs or if you're not paying attention, those immediately align to one another, and so you know those are the chronograph hands. They all have a red mark on them. And I think that while practical, it's also a nice design touch to add a little more color to an otherwise very sterile black and white color dial face. The indices are applied. They're gonna have that slope front, and then they kind of lift up to a blocked back, and they have a little bit of lume there on that front that slopes down. And so you don't get a huge amount of lume for your money, but what you get is something that looks really pleasing. As you catch it in different light, it tends to have a lot of reflection, and those indices really accentuate that. So not only are you going to get reflection on the bezel itself, but those indices are as well. The action on the chronograph is really smooth. Like most column wheel chronographs, the first action of the chronograph is a little stiff, and then after that it's really easy. So it's a really easy tap, and then it stops, a tap, it starts again, and then obviously resets. Specs are on the screen. In terms of wearability, it's 41mm case. It tends to wear like a 41. It's got an overall blockier lug layout, and so it doesn't kind of sink into the wrist. While it lays over the wrist well, it doesn't really just like disappear on that wrist. The way the lugs are finished and shaped actually really reminds me of my Zen 104 that I do miss on occasion, but the way those lugs are laid out and the way it sits on my wrist reminds me of that, although a little bit taller than the Zen 104. It doesn't feel that much taller, but it is obviously taller. And then obviously it also has a date complication down at 4:30. I don't typically like date complications at 4:30. In this case, I also don't really like it. It's not overwhelming and it doesn't stand out that much. You can kind of forget about it, but the 4:30 date, both on this and on a Navitimer, while I love both of these watches, this and a Navitimer, I really don't like it. I know it doesn't really fit anywhere else, but I really would prefer this watch with just no date window. I think it would obviously look a little bit more symmetrical, and it would look really nice for someone like me, but for practicality purposes and most people that are gonna buy this watch, a date window is a very nice complication that makes this a little bit nicer than a Daytona that doesn't have one. So what do I like about the watch? What I love is the design. I love the look. I love the feeling of the watch on my wrist. I love the 1/10 of a second chronograph. I love the movement. You can look at this thing for a long time and still not figure out exactly what everything's doing. There's a whole lot of layers going on in this chronograph. And not just that, but it's also moving at hyperspeed. I've tried to take a video of the balance wheel in slow motion, and this is as much as I can slow it down because it's beating 10 times every second. So this thing is just whipping along. Now, that kind of leads into a negative a little later I'll get into, but in terms of what it looks like and how it feels and the smoothness of the running seconds hand, especially since it's smaller on the dial, it's really cool to see and it's a lot of fun. Now the automatic rotor I wish was taken off. For me, again, I like manual round chronographs. I have no problem with having to wind it every day. And so if they got rid of that rotor, I could see the movement a little bit better. And then I obviously would lose a little thickness. But again, for practicality purposes, most people prefer an automatic movement. I also really love the tricolor registers. I've always loved that about Zenith watches. Those tricolor registers have always been really subtle, but also with enough color that someone like me, someone conservative, would wear them. And so I've always considered looking at Zenith, but it wasn't really until this watch that I thought, okay, I need to see that in person. And this one is really, really nice. And that's one of the features I really love about it. The last one is just the flashiness. Again, it's what you would expect. When you want a watch that's a little louder, that says that you're wearing something nice, this is it. I don't get the feeling that I'm wearing a Rolex Daytona or something that looks like a Rolex Daytona. It doesn't feel like a compromise that I wanted a Rolex Daytona, but this is more attainable or less money. It feels like a very different watch. It is a very different watch, both in terms of how it sits on the wrist and in terms of the overall look and layout. The bezel may be the same, but everything inside that bezel is different, so that when you look at it, especially if you look at it from afar or in a mirror, it doesn't give me Daytona vibes. It gives me Zenith vibes, but it just happens to also have a really interesting shiny ceramic bezel outside of a Zenith watch. Negatives. So the first one is going to be serviceability for me. 36,000 beats per hour means that this thing is going to be ticking along, and it's going to need servicing more often than something that has a lower beat rate. And that's just because of friction. The more that those pallets are whacking against the escape wheel and having that sliding motion, the more that it's going to wear down the oils, and it's going to need to get serviced. So that's one of the downsides for me. One of the other ones is kind of a downside and kind of an upside. So while I like screw down pushers and screw down crowns, in this case, I like the accessibility of not having it, but it says it's 100-meter water resistance. Now, I believe them, but because I don't have that extra reassurance, it doesn't give me that extra feeling that I could wear it swimming or in a pool. That being said, it is kind of nice to be able to activate it without having to unscrew one of those pushers. So I don't know if that's a negative or a positive, but in my case, it's probably a negative. I prefer water resistance over the functionality of having an easy to use chronograph pusher, I suppose. The 4:30 date window, not a fan, and the bracelet. Now, the other thing that is very similar between this and the Daytona is going to be the bracelet itself. It looks like a slightly varied version of an oyster bracelet with a polished center link. This one is basically the same. Now, what I don't like about this watch and its bracelet is going to be, one, the polished center link. Not a huge fan of that because I'm going to scuff this thing like crazy immediately. It also has polished surfaces on almost every single edge, from the bevel and the lugs to the sides of the case to then the center link. This thing is going to look like I beat the crap out of it after about 3 weeks. And so that's not really that appealing to me, unless this was a watch that I kind of brought out when I really wanted to step it up and I really babied it. But I'm not really someone that babies their watches very well. The main thing I don't like is the clasp. This clasp itself feels like a watch that's worth a third of this price or less, because a third of this price is going to be a Tudor. And so you got to go pretty way down. This clasp itself and how it actuates is even less pleasing than this. This is an SPB 143 clasp. This thing is kind of nicer to use than the Zenith here, because this just feels like an old Rolex flip lock clasp, except the way that this comes in and out, the way that this clasp closes, open and closed, it just feels really cheap. And for a watch that costs as much as this does at $11,000, this clasp closure here does not give me a good feeling. The other thing I don't like is actually opening the clasp. It's not easy to lift open. I mean, or close. It's really difficult to try and get open or close because you can't get your fingernail in there, and it doesn't really want to open. It doesn't really want to do either of those things. It feels like it's meant to stay closed and not really open or close for you. So not a huge fan of those two things. What I've learned is that if you pull on the sides, it comes off. That's how you open it and how you close it, so you're not sticking your fingernail in there. But I don't really like that I have to change how I open and close a clasp just because it's built a little cheaply. Now, the added advantage there is that this bracelet itself feels really light, so that's nice, but the clasp experience is not one that I really enjoy that much. So if I was going to keep this, given the center links being polished and that clasp, I would immediately put this thing on a strap and it would live on that strap as opposed to this bracelet. So the Zenith Chronomaster Sport, I don't think I'm going to be keeping it, but I really like it. I think it's going to be a good fit for someone out there that's looking for a chronograph that's a little bit dressier, a little bit more noticeable, and that they'll really enjoy the reflections that this thing casts off as they're looking at it. So do me a favor and subscribe. Drop a like if you like videos like this. What do you guys think? Give me an idea of what you think of this watch in general, how it's priced, and how it looks on the secondary market these days. I feel like it's a pretty good value for the watch that it is, with the exception of the clasp, of course. So let me know. I mean, what do you guys think of Zenith in general and the move to add the Chronomaster Sport and the variations they have in it now? I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.